Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first, more or less traditional evidential hearing to be conducted by the inquiry. Up to now, we've all had to do it on remote screens. It's a great relief to do it in the flesh again. Before we start, may I ask those of you in the public area at the back to look at the document, the single-page document put in front of you, which explains why what I'm about to say must be complied with. Anyone with a handheld electronic device may, of course, use it to transmit to the outside world silently what you hear, including the evidence that you hear, in this hearing room, but only after 10 minutes have elapsed from the event that you are describing. The purpose is explained in the document. It's briefly to ensure that orders that I have made are upheld. You may not use those devices for recording or for photographing. It's important that these restrictions are complied with. If they're not, it will cause a great deal of trouble and may result in a sanction for the person or persons breaching them. Rearrange my desk so that I can see everybody a little more clearly.
Thank you. Welcome to day one of evidential hearings at the Undercover Policing Inquiry. My name is Neil Fernandez and I am the hearings manager. There is no fire alarm testing expected today, so if the fire alarm does go off, please follow the fire exit signs and make your way to the muster point, which is the Hard Rock Hotel, Great Cumberland Place. On the arrival at the muster point, please make yourself known to a fire marshal who will be wearing a high visibility jacket and who will be keeping a register of all attendees. The fire marshals will also be responsible for letting everyone know when it's safe to return in liaison with representatives from the Thistle Hotel. I now hand over to the Chairman, Sir John Mitting, to formally start today's proceedings. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. German, may I first of all establish how I may address you without causing offence? Is it Ms., Miss or Mrs.?
Yeah, Ms is fine.
Ms, right.
I'm a doctor as well, but probably best to stick to Ms, I think.
I will do whatever you prefer.
Okay. That's great, thank you.
Ms. German, I understand that you wish to affirm, and Mr. Fernandez will read the words out to you to permit you to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Chairman. Repeat after me. I solemnly declare and affirm.
I solemnly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence that I shall give.
Will be the truth.
Will be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Barr is now going to ask you questions on behalf of the inquiry. Before he does, may I explain two things? One of them arises from your own written witness statement, in which you suggest that some of the questions are based on a misappreciation of what was going on and a preconceived view that is wrong. First of all, may I make it clear, neither I nor my inquiry team have a preconceived view about what was going on. We're here to inquire into what happened, not to assert a preconceived view. And many of the questions that you were asked in the Rule 9 request were asked because of the information that we have from contemporaneous documents and the like, which give one version of what occurred to permit you to respond to it. Likewise, when he asks questions, it will be on behalf of the inquiry, but he will also be putting questions to you which on topics and to some extent in the form that have been suggested by other core participants in the inquiry with whose views you may well disagree.
Thank you for explaining that. I would just, yes, and I'm sure we can come to it in the course of the evidence.
Yes, if there's anything you would like to say at this stage, please do so.
Well, I would just like to repeat that I do think a number of the questions do stem from misconception, but hopefully I'll have a chance to discuss that further as we go on.
Certainly.
Thanks.
Mr. Barr.
Thank you, sir. Ms. German, could we start with your full name, please?
My full name is Lindsey Ann German.
And you've provided a very fulsome witness statement to the inquiry dated the 14th of February 2022. Are the contents of that witness statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
And today we're seeking your assistance in relation to what we call the Tranche 1 era, that is from 1968 until the early 80s, 1982, 1983 or thereabouts. I'd like to start with a little bit about your activism and your career in the relevant period with the International Socialists, which became the Socialist Workers' Party. You describe in your witness statement an early political awakening with a revulsion to war, colonialism, racism, fascism, and class inequality. Is that right?
That's right.
And you started your activism with the Stop the 70 campaign in Leicester as a student.
That's the first demonstration that I went on.
And then you joined the Socialist Society at the London School of Economics.
That's right, yes, in
You were-
1972.
And in that same year, you were greatly moved by the three big industrial disputes of that year, the miners' strike, the dockers' strike, and the builders' strike.
That's right, and it was a time when there was a very, very high level of industrial action, and I felt that this was something that really should be supported, so I got very involved in those.
And it was in 1972 that you joined the Hillingdon branch of what was then the International Socialists.
That's right, yeah.
And after you'd completed your studies, you became the full-time student organiser in 1975.
Yes,
And you remained a full-time worker within the Socialist Workers' Party for the rest of the Tranche 1 era.
that's right, yeah.
In 1977, you became the full-time district organiser for Central London.
Yes,
And then in 1979, you were voted onto the Central Committee as a woman's organiser.
yes.
Can you help us with how big the Central Committee was?
Well, as I recall, it was about 10 people at the time. I couldn't be exactly right about that, but that kind of number. It was a relatively small body of people. It was answerable to bigger committees inside the International Socialists, but it was around that size, yes.
But was that the ultimate executive decision-making body within the SWP?
It was. It was the day-to-day organising body of the SWP, yes.
Can I turn now to the aims of the Socialist Workers' Party? What I'm going to do is put what I hope are a series of reasonably straightforward propositions to you, and then at the end, just to make sure I've not missed anything and you've got the chance to be absolutely clear with us, I'll ask you if I've missed anything. The Socialist Workers' Party is a revolutionary socialist movement.
That's right.
And the aim is to bring about a socialist society.
Yes.
And that requires the self-emancipation of the working class.
That's right, and I think it's important to stress this. This isn't something that's done on behalf of people. It's something which we saw, and I continue to see, as something that has to be the majority of people changing society for the better.
And self-emancipation
That's
is a
right,
very
yes.
important part of the
Of course,
philosophy, isn't
of course.
it? And so the struggle, it can only be achieved by their struggle.
Of course, yes, that it can't be substituted for by any small group of people who's acting on their behalf.
And the outcome would be that new institutions would replace old institutions. So ultimately, you would like to see elected workers' councils making decisions for the country rather than the current parliamentary arrangements that we have today.
Well, I think for any socialist of my sort, you see Parliament as very, very limited in terms of the democracy that it achieves. And the more it's aged as an institution, in a way, the less democratic it's become, that it doesn't really represent the interests of wide-ranging number of people. And particularly, I think a lot of people are very alienated from Parliament at the moment. So this idea of self-emancipation is a higher form of democracy. It involves more people. It involves people being elected from workplaces, from communities, and making their own decisions about how a society is run.
And so it is the end goal is you do away with Parliament, replace it with workers' councils, and you think that the result is you get a country which is run by the people in the interests of the people, and not a country which is run in the interests of profit by a small elite through Parliament.
That's right, and it is something that I think, as I say, is a much wider, higher form of democracy than the one we have now.
And essentially, this is a replacement of a capitalist society with a socialist society.
That would be the ultimate aim, but of course that is a situation we're still quite a long way away from. But that is the idea of it, that society would be run on the basis of need and not of profit, which, in my opinion, would be a big improvement on what we have now.
Have I missed anything fundamental about the aims of the SWP?
Well, I think it's perhaps worth putting a little bit in context that this is something that when I joined, and when I think most people become socialists, revolutionary socialists of that sort, it's not that we felt this was an immediate achievable aim. It was something we desired to happen, but we recognised as a few thousand people, and even if you add together other organisations, tens of thousands of people, weren't in a position to do. So I think one of the important things is to stress that it's if you like, it's an aim that we have, but it's not something we thought was going to happen in 1979 or 1980.
I'll come back to progress in a moment. Can we deal before then with methods? Again, I'm going to put some propositions to you to see whether you agree with them. First of all, is the main method you use to build support amongst the working class until ultimately they have the power to overthrow the current institutions?
Well, that's not quite a method, is it? I mean, what do you mean by a method? How do...
It's building support. A lot of the work you do is about spreading your message, spreading your philosophy within the working class to try and generate the bottom-up self-emancipation that we talked about earlier.
And that takes the form of activity in trade unions, takes the form of selling papers and generally arguing about these kinds of things, yes. Yeah.
So that the sort of places that the SWP was active in the Tranche 1 era were workplaces in those days, particularly within industry, in the civil service.
That's right, in all of those that we had. For a time we had factory branches and we had workplace branches, and we would organise people within those workplaces, but also geographically as well, and in students and all the different areas that we thought we could.
And schools as well.
We didn't have permanent organisation in schools, but there were at times when we were involved in activity around schools, particularly against the National Front, but also other issues as well.
A lot of anti-racism work?
Very much so.
Women's rights?
Yes.
And lots of single issues, such as the Irish question, campaigns against cuts, closures, and supporting individual types of industrial action.
That's right. That was the range of things that we did, and we would get involved in different issues as they were important. For example, in the second half of the 70s, there were big campaigns around abortion because that was something that was subject to restrictions, that there was attempts through Parliament to restrict the right of abortion. So there were big demonstrations, big campaigns, which we were involved in, and that's just one campaign, but those were the sorts of things we did, yes.
And a lot of political education.
Yeah, of course.
And you were seeking to expand your membership.
Yes, and we did. We did expand our membership.
It's fair to say, isn't it, that your organisation grew a great deal during the 1970s,
That's
didn't
right.
it? Have I missed anything fundamental about the methods that the SWP and its predecessor was using in the time we're talking about?
I just think, no, I don't think you've missed anything, but I think it's just, you seem to be sort of dividing it up into different things rather than looking at it more as a totality, which it was. You know, there was the activity, but also there's the political discussions, political debate, all those sorts of things, which were very important to us at the time.
So it's all wrapped up.
It's all part of the same process, yes.
Now, would it be fair to say that the SWP pushed its work very hard?
Well, we were enthusiastic about what we did. I don't know whether it's right to say we pushed it very hard, but
I'll give you some examples so we can explore that. So, for example, in terms of industrial disputes, very much your philosophy as an organisation was that escalation would tend to give a better outcome for the working people who you were supporting.
well, I don't think that's quite the right way to look at industrial disputes. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, industrial disputes arise when people have a grievance, and we had very, very big ones, as you've referred to, in the early 70s over the miners and the dockers who were put in prison. We had all those sorts of things. But essentially, what you've got with strikes is people take strike action when they don't have any other outlet to do so. In that situation, we would all support the strikes. We would want them to be as rapid as possible, as successful as possible in terms of winning their demands. But in terms of sort of pushing them to be escalated as much as possible, this was something which was part of the trade union movement. It wasn't something that we did separately from the trade union movement as a whole. If you supported the strikes, that's what you did.
Yeah, but your organisation did support the strikes.
Absolutely,
and
yes.
you would turn out in force if you could muster it, and you would back the strikers to the hilt because you wanted to see them win.
That's right. But I also think it's worth saying that in most cases with strikes, actually, they're ones that take place with relatively small numbers of people. They're ones that take place with relatively small picket lines, and we supported all of those. I mean, when I was Central London organiser, there was a strike of steakhouses here in Central London, and I would go most days, I would go and see them, and they had perhaps 5 or 6 people on the picket line. They weren't mass pickets most of the time. So there's differences and different sorts of strikes.
Differences in scale, but would it be fair to say that on the whole, you thought that by pressing management, workers were likely to get a better outcome?
Absolutely, and I still do. I think that, we've seen since the 70s the halving of trade union membership, and that's been generally has gone alongside a much worse condition for many working people.
And would another example of where considerable passion and resolve was deployed was in your work confronting racists?
I think it's worth putting this in context. Yes, that's absolutely true, but I think it's worth putting in context that we had in the 70s a very big growth in fascist organisation in the second half of the 70s. We connected that very much with the disappointment that people felt with the Labour government and the way in which wages were being cut and general disappointment. And there was a very, very strong atmosphere there of the sense that the fascists were growing. There was 100,000 votes for the National Front in London in 1977, and that was a very frightening prospect. So I think for most of us, we saw racism as a very central issue that we had to confront, and we saw it as a way, if racism and fascism was allowed to grow, it would seriously weaken working class organisation. I think it's also worth saying that this was, I was of the generation that my parents were. My dad was in the invasion of Sicily. He was in the Navy for 5 years during the war. One of my uncles lost his leg at Nijmegen. I mean, the war was very, very real to millions of people then. And I think the idea that you saw fascism returning in the 1970s was a very frightening thing, not just to my generation, but to older generations as well.
And the far right were certainly active on the streets in the 1970s, weren't they?
They certainly were, yes.
And your organisation thought it essential to confront those far right activists on the street, didn't you?
We did, because if you look at what they modelled themselves on, they modelled themselves very much on the way in which Hitler organised before he came to power in 1933. And therefore street protests, particularly in immigrant areas, were very, very important to them. And Hitler himself was quoted as saying that the only thing that could have stopped him was if people had stopped him sufficiently early when he was still relatively part of a relatively small group, whereas obviously by 1932-33, Hitler was a much, much bigger force. So we thought it was extremely important that we did confront them and say that they didn't have the right to march. And of course, they always chose to march through areas with big numbers of black and Asian people. That was a very deliberate, intimidatory practice on their part.
Well, we'll come back to some of that activity in more detail later. But what I'd like to do now is tie together the aims that we've explored and the methods that you were using to advance towards realising those aims. It was ultimately the expectation, or at least the hope, that you'd get to a stage where the working class was strong enough to overthrow existing institutions.
Well, that's, as I said to you earlier, that was the aim in the general sense. That's what we believed needed to happen in order to achieve a socialist society. But we also were very realistic that this wasn't about to happen. And therefore, for example, we stood in parliamentary elections in the 1970s in order to put our arguments across. So it wasn't that we were just saying, okay, this is all going to happen in the next few years. What we felt was we had to use any avenue to get our arguments across. We knew the majority of workers still looked to Labour Party and still looked to Parliament for change, and therefore we engaged in that arena as well.
Thank you. I understand that. At the moment, I'm moving into a slightly more hypothetical scenario because I appreciate it never reached that stage in the time we're talking about. But it was the ultimate aim to use these methods of campaigning to build up the working class to the point where they could overthrow the existing institutions. I mean, I think you've previously agreed with that proposition.
Yes, and I think it's just worth saying as well that that is, we felt that one of the ways that you did this was by working round campaigns, round strikes and so on, because that strengthened confidence and organisation among working class people, yeah.
Now, I appreciate the next step didn't happen, but I want to ask you this in terms of what might have been anticipated. Did you anticipate that if the working class had ever become strong enough to overthrow existing institutions, that before they were able to do so, it was overwhelmingly likely that the state would use force to prevent that happening?
Yes, we did think that, and of course we had the very recent example of the coup in Chile, where exactly that process had taken place, where a democratically elected government had been overthrown because it had policies which didn't fit with what the Chilean ruling class wanted, or indeed what the CIA wanted, who was involved in it as well.
And the same had happened in Spain in the 1930s.
The same happened in Spain in the 1930s, and it's worth just remembering that in Portugal and Spain, where you had the transition to democracy in the mid-1970s, there was also, people felt there was a threat of that as well there. So these were real concerns that people had.
And at that stage, would it be fair to say that the Socialist Workers' Party would consider the use of force both acceptable and necessary?
I think, again, this needs to be looked at in the context. If you look at most movements, Chile's a good example, but it's true, I think, of most revolutions, that actually they're not fantastically violent events, that actually it's the counter-revolution, if you like. This is true in the French Revolution, it's true in the Russian Revolution in lots of senses, that it's the counter-revolution where you see much more violence. But yes, we were prepared to defend ourselves, and we were prepared, if necessary, to defend the institutions of working class organisation and working class power against any attempt to stop them achieving these things democratically.
Right, I just want to show you a document. Could we go to it's UCPI 5018503. For those working from the hard copy, it's volume 2, tab 30. Can you see that?
No, where is it?
That is not the right document. Sorry, the document I'd like is it's UCPI 5019542.
I don't have a... I don't think the screen's working.
Is your screen working, Ms.
No.
German? No.
No.
Right. Okay. We will have to do something about that. I can show you for these purposes the document, but then the public will not be able to see it. So would you like to rise for a moment while we sort this out?
I fear so. I'm afraid we have these technical difficulties. They're bound to occur.
Okay.
Eventually, we'll overcome them.
Yeah, can I have it so I can just see it? What's it about?
found, but not yet the permanent one.
That's absolutely right, sir. And could I just take a moment now to remind people that when we have short adjournments, please would people sitting at the back not approach witnesses. It's important that witnesses give their evidence alone. Ms. German, the document that's up on the screen is a document which is a report about the National Student Aggregate. If we could turn to page 16 within that file, please. One of the documents that was attached to this SDS report on the National Student Aggregate in 1983 was this document, which appears to be produced by the Socialist Worker Student Society, with the headline "Fight for a Change," and if we scroll down to socialism. A good deal of the basic propositions about the SWP that I put to you, I got from this document because
dear.
it sets it out.
Maybe you need to read a bit more.
Sets it
than
out
just
all.
the leaflets.
Sets it out all very simply. The bit that I particularly want to put to you under the headline "Workers' Power." The alternative to Labour is revolutionary socialism, the armed seizure of power by the working class and the creation of a new kind of society. Now, following on the questions I asked you before we had to adjourn, could you explain, please, where the armed seizure of power comes into matters?
Well, I think I have explained that really, that when people face, when there is a situation where there's a possibility of revolutionary change or systematic change, then this is when you get the old establishment which really fights back against that change. And that's when you need to be prepared to do this. I mean, this isn't, you know, when I said to you about maybe reading a bit more on this topic, I mean, Marx made this point in 1871 at the defeat of the Paris Commune, when he then took the conclusion that you couldn't peacefully overthrow the system, that you would have to be prepared for, as happened in Paris, for armies to attack you, for people to be killed in large numbers, and you would need to defend yourself. And that's exactly what that says there. So I think, you know, I don't think that's different from what I've been explaining.
And so, to be clear, there is no question of the SWP using arms during the 1970s.
Of course not. I mean, this is, you know, I think when I said, and I said earlier about the misconceptions about what we're saying, I think there's this kind of concept of small groups of people with arms, I don't know, infiltrating the police or the army or any of these sorts of things. This was never on the agenda, and we knew the situation was such, with even at our largest of several thousand members, that this would have been completely counterproductive. It wouldn't have involved self-emancipation. It wouldn't have involved the mass of workers acting on their own behalf. It would have been a small, I don't know what you want to call it, a putsch or whatever, by a minority on behalf of a minority. And everything you read about our tradition, the International Socialists, the SWP, all of those, actually is very much against that kind of approach. It's a difference that goes back to the differences that Marx had with Bakunin and all sorts of other people. It's a fundamental difference, and it's one that I've always believed, that you'd have to have the mass of people fighting for change on their behalf.
Now, I want to move to the question of progress, quite accepting it never got to a revolutionary situation in the 1970s and 1980s, but there were fluctuations during this period which I want to explore with you. Before you even joined the International Socialists in 1968, was there a feeling of excitement amongst revolutionaries that something might be happening, given what was occurring in France at the time?
Very much so. I mean, I went to France to improve my French in April 1968, and unfortunately missed the, you could see all the posters and things up then. And when I came back and saw all the places I'd been on the television, that was a feeling I think lots and lots of people around the world felt, that this was a real chance of change. It was an upsurge and very, very important. It did mark the beginning of a period of intense political change in France and elsewhere.
And was there a feeling that the same might be beginning to happen here with the enormous numbers of people who turned out, especially to the anti-Vietnam demonstrations, particularly in March, and then later on in October of that year?
They were very big demonstrations compared to previous demonstrations in Britain, certainly in my lifetime, and they were ones that people felt, again, this was people coming on the streets, demonstrating, and it marked a new politics which people had hope of the Labour government, which was elected in '64, but this was going beyond what the Labour government wanted to do, much, much more so, and very, very clearly in support of a group of people who were fighting against the Americans in Vietnam.
And you've explained that the feeling that started in 1968 carried on for a few years after that. Would you link it in to what was happening in 1972 with some very big strikes, and the miners' strike in particular being very successful?
I think what happened after '68 was you got the development of, particularly in Britain and Italy, but other places in the world, you got the development of very, very big strikes, and Britain and Italy had the two biggest in Europe. And so, yes, they were connected. And it was part of, I think, again, for my generation, you had people who were becoming radicalised over political issues, as you've explained, in terms of apartheid, South Africa, racism, those sorts of issues. But also this was taking place in the workplace among young workers who'd had rising living standards and who expected that they would be able to achieve more, and that's what they were campaigning for. So yes, I think those things are connected, and it was part of a general wave of political activism, economic activism, whatever you want to call it, in that period from '68 till round about 75, I suppose.
The other big thing that happens is in '74 the Conservative government falls, doesn't it, again in the face of serious industrial disputes.
That's right. The Heath government was brought down by the second miners' strike in 1974.
So in that period, in the late 60s and early 70s, was there a sense that you were getting somewhere with your revolutionary progress?
There was a sense that more people were breaking from the ideas of Labour, if you like, and looking to the left of Labour. I think that was a very strong feeling, and that was true in the International Socialists. We recruited lots of workers from car factories, from different factories around the country, and yes, I think there was a sense that people were moving towards the idea that there needed to be a more fundamental change than had been achieved by the Labour government. I think they were right in that.
And then, as those of us who were around in those days all know, we get to 1979 and the winter of discontent. Before we get on to Margaret Thatcher, could you help us with, in your estimation, what was the high point for your party's aspirations during the 1970s? What was the closest that you think you got to achieving your goals?
I think in terms of the aspirations of the International Socialists and the SWP was to become a major force on the left in Britain, and particularly to replace the Communist Party, which was then much, much bigger than we were. It was still a considerably large organisation, but to replace it politically and industrially. And we achieved some of that, but not obviously all of it.
And so in terms of progress to a situation where the working class had the means to overthrow, or the will and the support and the motivation to overthrow the institutions of the existing state, on a scale of 1 to 10, What do you think is a high point? What would you score your high point in the 1970s?
I mean, I think the high point of the 1970s was 1972 with the very, very big strikes, which were very, very successful. As you say, you then had the second miners' strike. But I think this is, when we look at it, the question of whether you can overthrow society, whether you can have a revolution, doesn't lie with the people who term themselves revolutionaries. It lies with the people who actually are going to make that revolution themselves. At this time, there actually was a revolution going on in Portugal, which went on for something like 18 months. And I think people saw that as a kind of model of what could happen elsewhere. But that was a very different situation from the situation we faced in Britain. This was a situation where people had lived under fascism for decades, and where the colonial wars in Angola and Mozambique were creating mass disaffection among the army. So those were the particular circumstances. So we didn't think we were anywhere close to that at that time.
I mean, I won't press you if you don't want to put a number on it, but so would you prefer to say you weren't anywhere close?
Yes, we weren't anywhere close, absolutely.
Right. And then Margaret Thatcher comes to power in 1979. Would it be fair to say that in that period, late 1970s, early 1980s, the tide recedes and you thought that revolution seemed a very long way off?
We had a Tory government which was very dedicated to attacking working people. We now know that there were a whole number of the Ridley Plan, all sorts of things, where they systematically took on the unions and working class people in order to weaken them. And you had a whole number of other policies that Thatcher pursued, which were also aimed at doing this. It's worth remembering, though, that although this was a situation electorally, it was another 5 years, really, until the defeat of the miners' strike in 1984 to 85, where she actually succeeded in beginning to break the unions. There were very big protests in the early years of Thatcher, particularly very big demonstrations about unemployment, very big strikes which went on, steel strike, railway strike. So it wasn't that straight away you can see there's a big defeat electorally, obviously, but that wasn't massively surprising given how, by that point, how unpopular the Labour government under Callaghan was. But it took some years for that defeat to follow through industrially, if you like, and that was the crucial point in that was the miners' strike, I think, in 84 to 85.
But in terms of where you were going in progressing towards your aim, would you describe those years in the early 80s as a time in which your progress was moving forwards or backwards?
I think we came to a recognition very early on as an organisation that the working class movement was in retreat. And we saw that, I think, before many other organisations on the left, for the reasons that I've just explained. There were all these strikes, all these things going on. So we did come to that recognition. Nonetheless, for an organisation of our size, it was still possible to hold big meetings, to recruit people, to do all those sorts of things. So it wasn't like an instant outcome from the election of Thatcher. There was still a lot of people who were ready to campaign over a range of things. There were also very big events like the riots in London in 1981, which were a reflection of how there was a large section of the population who were disaffected with Thatcher's policy. So there were all those things that were important for us to take on board. So it was a mixed picture, I think, at the time.
And it's certainly the case, isn't it, that you and your organisation didn't give up. If anything, you redoubled your efforts.
We certainly didn't give up, and we saw it as something, this was a big attack on the working class after the successes of the early 70s in particular. And so we were determined to keep going. Yes, we did.
Can I move now to a completely different topic? It's a question of what external support, by which I mean support from outside the country, the SWP I think didn't have, is going to be the theme of my questions. Is it right to say that no nation state backed the Socialist Workers' Party from abroad.
Of course, and it's just worth reiterating, because again, I know that sometimes it's put in some of these reports, that our politics was always that we didn't see any other nation state as a kind of model of socialism. So we regarded the Soviet Union at the time, for example, as state capitalist, so as a different form of capitalism, but nonetheless a capitalist state. So yeah, we didn't get support, and we didn't seek support from any other state.
Yeah, and in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's right, isn't it? There's no state supporting any Trotskyist philosophy.
To the best of my knowledge, there isn't. I'd be very surprised if we hadn't heard about it by now.
The Soviet Union, positively hostile to Trotskyism.
Yes,
China, the same.
yes.
Completely different topic again now. Openness. The degree of openness with which you and your organisation conducted its political business. In many ways, it was an open party, wasn't it? Easy to join?
It was very easy to join, and as we see from the evidence from this inquiry, we can see that perhaps too easy for some people to join. But it was. We had an open recruitment policy. We believed that people didn't need to take an exam to join our organisation, that you learn in the process of organising and activity and going to meetings and things like that. So yes, we had that policy.
No vetting, no party names, nothing like that.
We didn't have party names at all, apart from the people, again, the undercover police were the only people who had false names, to the best of my knowledge, in the SWP.
Lots of public meetings.
I'm sure you've been through all the evidence of this, lots of public meetings. We sold a newspaper which was perfectly open and available to anybody who was prepared to buy it. I think the undercover police had a subscription to it at one point. We had a bookshop where people could go and buy, obviously not mainly our books, but books of a left persuasion of all sorts of things. We were an open organisation.
Lots of opportunity for people who joined your organisation to get involved and to participate in the life and the running of the party.
That's right, yes.
And we'll come back to that a little later. But there comes a point, doesn't there, where not everything is done out in the open. And we drew your attention when you were asked to produce a witness statement to the 1978 National Delegate Conference, where a number of security measures were taken, weren't they, to ensure the confidentiality in particular of various documents about party affairs. Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
I want to explore with you what the motivations were for those security measures. The first one that I think you've mentioned in your statement is fear of state surveillance. In your own words, could you articulate what it was that you didn't want them doing and why?
It wasn't particularly a question of the discussions we had in conferences being discussions we wouldn't want to have in public. And usually we would have a report of the conferences in our publications, and we would have meetings afterwards, which certainly some non-members could go to, which explained what had happened to them. But I think we were worried about a number of things. Firstly, the threat to particular members of the SWP, particularly people who were in industry, who were under threat of blacklisting. And as we know, that has been something which has affected generations now of people on the left, and some of this has come out in the inquiry, and some more, no doubt, will come out about it. So we were very worried about that, and we were worried about people's names being, their proper names being given, or exactly where they weren't being given, because we knew people were being sacked. We knew people were not getting jobs, even though they seemed very well qualified for these jobs. So, yes, we were concerned about those things. We were also worried in general about state surveillance, that we didn't believe that the state had the right to effectively spy on what we were doing in meetings. And I think it's also fair to say that in that particular period, where there was a very big threat from the National Front, as we'll no doubt come on to talk about, that we didn't want any infiltration from them or from the far right or anything going to them which could be interpreted as helpful to them. So I think for all those reasons, we took that particular stance at that conference in particular.
And would it be fair to say that you wanted the freedom to associate and express yourselves politically without state interference?
That's right. And I think this is something that any party, I mean, not just parties of this sort of persuasion, but I think any party does have private meetings and private discussions. I think this is true, you know, for any party of any sort. They don't have everything out in the open for perfectly understandable reasons.
Well, that might be another separate reason that every organisation has some information that it wishes to keep confidential.
Well, financial, membership, all these sorts of things, I think it's perfectly reasonable to do this.
Can we move now to the attitude of the Socialist Workers' Party to the police? Can we start at a philosophical level? Is it the view of the SWP that the state uses the police to divide and rule?
I'm not sure divide and rule is the right way to express it. I would say that the police are an organisation which is used in order to ensure that certain sorts of laws are followed and certain sorts of rule is followed. But I'm not sure divide and rule is the right way to describe that.
I got that from your witness statement.
Oh, right,
so
okay, well, my apologies. My apologies if I said that. So
if you want to clarify exactly what you mean, please do.
all I mean is that I think that when you're talking about the police, they act in a certain way to do with certain crimes. And there's some crimes that they regard as more important and there's some crimes they regard as less important. And of course, I think what I said about divide and rule was to do with ethnic minorities in particular. Is that correct from the witness statement?
We can have a look. It's paragraph 78 of your witness statement. Just find it and make sure I give the people the right reference. It's UCPI 5034739, and once that is up, can we have page 33, please?
Oh, yeah, I see it, yeah. Could I just clarify, or would you want me to wait until people have got it up?
Once it's up and people can see it, it's right at the bottom of the page for those following the evidence. Yes, is there anything you wish to add or nuance to what you've expressed there?
I think it may be a kind of slightly misreading of the grammar, possibly. It says also a Marxist understanding of the state, the latter involving how the state uses war, the military, the police and racism to divide and rule. So these are different elements of the state, is what I'm saying. So it's about racism, it's about war, that they use those as well. Does
Fundamentally,
that clarify you?
Do you believe that the police is used along with those other institutions to divide and rule the working class?
Well, I think they're certainly used very, very often against working class people in terms of whether it's picket lines, whether it's stop and search of black and ethnic minorities. Yes, I do.
And we can turn it up if necessary, but over the page at paragraph 82, you say effectively they're used to keep the working class in check.
Yes, well, I think as you say, in a philosophical level, that's true. I mean, the police force was founded in the early stages of capitalism, so it was very consciously done in that way.
So what I'd like to know is, to what extent did that philosophical analysis, political analysis of the role of the police and the state have when it came to the SWP's treatment and dealings with the police?
Well, I think it made us aware of the way in which the police would behave, and that therefore we would look at the way that they behaved and see this as part of a wider picture, not as the actions of individual police.
And so would it be fair to say the SWP has a negative view of the police as its starting point?
I think it would be fair to say that it's not an institution that we thought would actually benefit working class people.
And did that mean that when you were out on the streets forcefully challenging the racists, that if the police got in your way, they were essentially fair game?
No, I don't think that's the right interpretation of it. I think our interpretation of it was that during these years, the police repeatedly allowed the fascists to march in areas where they deliberately were going in there in order to intimidate and harass local black and Asian people. So we saw it in that way. And we saw it as something that we felt wasn't acceptable. And I think what's come out from what I've seen so far of the inquiry is actually that there clearly was a position that they would protect these marches, and there clearly was a position that they were treated more favourably, I would say, than people demonstrating against them.
And what was your organisation's response to that, so far as how you treated the police was concerned?
Well, it wasn't about individual treatment of the police. It was about how we thought we had to respond to this threat of fascism. And we saw this in a number of ways, but one of the crucial ways we saw it was actually to say we are going to confront the fascists and that the police should not be protecting them.
And if we take it to another context, for example, if we think about the demonstrations outside the Conservative Party conference, we'll come back to in more detail later, but in that sort of scenario, was the view that the police were protecting the elite ruling class?
Well, they clearly do protect Conservative Party conferences, yes, they do.
And
it's just a matter of fact.
was it therefore viewed as legitimate to try and push through their cordons and things like that?
I don't know which one you're referring to, but people would have pushed through if they felt that they could do so, but that wasn't the main aim of demonstrating. And the main aim of demonstrating wasn't against the police, it was against the Tory party conference. So I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah. Accepting that distinction, though, what was the SWP's attitude to its members trying to push through a police line at one of its demonstrations?
Well, I think that depends entirely on the context. It depends entirely on the context. I mean, most demonstrations that people go on, this question just simply doesn't arise. It does arise over a whole number of things where, if you look at what has been going on, you find that the police are very much protecting the fascists, and particularly in the example of fascism, but obviously there may be other examples as well. But particularly with that, I think it is, I certainly would think if people pushed back against that, they would be justified in doing so.
We'll come back to some specific examples later, but for the moment, what I'd like to move on to next, Ms. German, is United Front work. Again, I'll put some what I think are basic propositions to me, and you can tell me where I'm getting it wrong. First of all, United Front is an attempt to unite the working class on specific issues.
That's right.
Main aim is to win its demands, and it also presents an opportunity for you to spread the message and to recruit. Specific examples. For the transcript, I can see you're nodding. Have I missed anything about the basic structure of a United Front?
Well, it's a very brief set of propositions here, so
yeah, we'll move on to the detail.
We'll move on to what it actually means. Yeah.
Would your work with the Anti-Nazi League be regarded as United Front work?
I think that was made very clear in my statement that the Anti-Nazi League was an example of a united front where very large numbers of people would become involved, and we would work with those people over the specific aim of defeating the fascists.
I'm going to put some propositions to you that come from Lord Haynes' evidence, because he obviously worked integrally as part of the ANL. One of the things he said was that the SWP had strong power and influence within the ANL and provided a lot of organisational support and background. Would you agree with that?
I think that's true.
He said that at the time of the National Front's demonstration at the by-election in Ilford North, he had spoken to Paul Holborough to agree to ensure that SWP activists did all that they could to avoid violence. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know about the specific. I was on the demonstration and I did leaflet in the Ilford North by-election, as I remember. But I don't know about the particular discussions between Paul Holborough and Peter Hain.
Can you recall if any particular line was disseminated through the party membership about violence at that particular demonstration?
I can't, but again, I don't think people set out on these demonstrations, are we going to have violence? They set out on the demonstrations to stop the National Front. And in most cases, this would have been something which didn't involve a high degree of violence, if any violence. It depended very, very much on, as I can see it, the police response, because nearly always the National Front demonstrations weren't particularly big. They were, you know, if you look at the pictures, you can see in Lewisham, you can see in Southall, you can see in all these, they're not particularly big. They're a few hundred. What is noticeable is the police presence around them, and that's to my recollection in Ilford, that wasn't the same degree. I can't remember exactly, but I don't think it was to the same degree. So I think this idea we're saying let's be violent on this demonstration, or we're not going to be violent on this demonstration, is really a misconception of how we approach the demonstrations.
Final proposition. The SWP had a reputation for far left sectarianism, but he thought that your party had curbed that tendency so far as the ANL was concerned. I appreciate that might be a slightly pejorative view that he expressed, but I wanted your reaction to it.
Well, I think it's Peter Hain's view. I think people in the SWP would have said, actually, far from being sectarian with the Anti-Nazi League, we really tried to broaden it out. We really saw it as a very, very important initiative, and one that would, and I think did, transform the political situation in Britain, because it was very influential in weakening the fascists, and with all the consequences that have since, or maybe negative consequences that have since happened, that we didn't have a growing strength of the fascists, and that was something that was very important to us. So I think Peter Hain's maybe being a bit unfair on this, that we were sectarian on everything else, but not on the Anti-Nazi League. I think we were the people who actually very much had the idea that we wanted it to be as broad as possible, which is why it involved people, not just like Peter Hain, but all sorts of other people who were a long way away politically from the SWP.
I'm going to ask you about a selection of other activities which I think fall under the heading United Front, and to explore the role of the SWP in them. First of all, can we start with School Kids Against the Nazis? To what extent was its creation and existence down to the Socialist Workers' Party?
Well, I think the Socialist Workers' Party was involved in School Kids Against the Nazis. We had school student members who organised. We were involved in the National Union of School Students, which I think was around the same kind of period. And there was a radicalisation among school students because, again, the National Front, and it's a different situation from the one we have now in London, certainly, but in London there was quite a lot of support for the National Front in a whole range of places, but including in schools. And so it was very, very important to be involved in challenging that. But of course, you know what it's like in schools. I mean, you will have a very small number of people who were SWP, and it will be much wider forces who began to organise against the National Front.
I mean, how would you describe the level of influence or control that the SWP had within SCAN?
I would say they had some influence, but so did all sorts of other people. I would say the SWP were a minority in SCAN.
Women's voice, essentially the same questions. To what extent was women's voice the creation of the SWP?
Well, Women's Voice is a slightly different project from what I would call a genuine United Front. It was aimed at being for people who didn't necessarily want to join the SWP, but who saw themselves as socialist women and people who wanted to organise. And of course, when we set it up, there was a lot of women's organisation taking place at that time. Throughout the 1970s, there were a whole range of issues. But it was always connected to the SWP, and it was always quite openly connected to the SWP. And so I don't think it really fits into the model of a United Front in the same way as the ANL or indeed the Right to Work campaign. It wasn't like a women's campaign around abortion, for example. It was a general socialist organisation of women.
Rock Against Racism?
Well, that's different again. Rock Against Racism was formed by a handful of people in, I think, 1976, after David Bowie made his racist comments at a concert. And
I think your statement said Eric Clapton.
Sorry,
I
Eric
think
Clapton. That's a big mistake, isn't it? Sorry about that. It was Eric Clapton. But that was a few people. Some of them were in the SWP, like David Widgery and a couple of other people. But a few of them weren't. So it was a sort of mixture. And they organised gigs and they got huge support for that. And they obviously were central to the carnival that we had in 1978 in Victoria Park. That's what they did. But so again, I don't quite see Rock Against Racism as, again, a classic United Front. It was a great initiative, and they still do things with it. And there's a lot of very, very good histories of it now. But it was very much based, obviously, on the music, and that was the centre of it. So it didn't have sort of mass membership or anything, it wasn't organised along those sorts of lines. You didn't go to a Rock Against Racism meeting every week or something like that. It was a different sort of setup.
Thank you. Now I'm going to put another of our witnesses' takes on some of your work to you for your comment. This is from Piers Corbyn. He said that from his memory, the international socialists were normally very intent on controlling whatever they were doing. So they would have things which we would describe, or I would describe, as fronts. So, they would have some campaign or other call something, but really it was just being controlled completely by the international socialists. Is that a fair observation in relation to any of your work?
I don't think so, and I don't know why Piers would know particularly. I mean, he didn't really work with us, as far as I know, about anything. And my only contact with him was when they organised a squat in, and no doubt he's told you about this, I expect, in Tolmer Square. They had a big squat there in the early 1970s. But as far as I know, he never worked with us over anything much at all. So it's obviously his opinion, but I don't think it's correct.
Can I move now to CND? And there was some SWP involvement within CND, wasn't there? Was that overt or surreptitious?
I don't understand this line. I mean, this line of questioning about overt and surreptitious, we didn't go secretly into CND. We were involved in it, insofar as we were involved in it at different periods, quite openly. And we sold our paper and we contributed in meetings and went on demonstrations in exactly the way that we would have done over any other campaign. And of course, CND was very big in the late 50s, early 60s, before my time, but IS members were involved in it then. And in the early 80s, it was very big, round Greenham Common and round the threat of missiles, cruise missiles in Europe. So we were involved in it then. I went on the Transpennine March and over Easter, I think 1981. But it was a completely open operation. We didn't hide it from anybody. So I don't quite understand that. Why do you think it was covert?
I just asked the question.
Okay, sorry, yeah, fair enough.
But on that line, is it fair to say that CND was nowhere near being controlled by the SWP? There's just no question of that.
Absolutely not. No involvement at that central level or at an organisational level. It was local initiatives that people took.
Now, we've seen some evidence that you thought that CND would be more effective if it was more militant. Could you explain to us in what ways you thought CND ought to become more militant?
I think this was about partly it's a kind of philosophical thing about CND's approach is very much or has been traditionally about non-violent direct action, sitting down and so on, which we took part in, but we wanted it to be more tied in to trade unions. We wanted it to be more tied into perhaps more militant action, but particularly in terms of working class action. That was the aim, really, that we wanted it to be tied to that kind of issue rather than just being sort of individual protest. That was how we wanted it to be more, I suppose, collective, if that makes sense to you.
What sort of methods did you think they should be using? Do you think they ought to be demonstrating more aggressively or something like that?
Not more aggressively. I think we thought that the demonstrations, we could have more of the demonstrations. They could be tied into other issues and so on. But these were fairly small tactical differences, really, about what we thought was the best way of operating.
Did you think they ought to get involved in direct action?
Well, they were involved in direct action. I don't think you can accuse CND of not being, going right back to the 50s. There was 100 of them arrested one day when they sat down in Trafalgar Square, I think.
We've got quite a lot of evidence about that.
Yeah, and
but what I'm interested in is essentially, were you and were other members of your party a voice pressing for more of that?
Yes, I think that's we would have liked to have seen more of that and more things where we actually linked up more with trade unions, which we thought was important. So perhaps militant isn't perhaps the right way to look at it, because many CND members did and still do get arrested for some of this. If they go to Faz Lane, for example, where Trident is, they sit down and they get carried off and get arrested. That's one of the... So I don't think you can say they're not involved in that kind of thing. I think perhaps we wanted it to be more central to working class organisation. That's perhaps the best way I can describe it.
Can we move now to Ireland and the SWP's position on the Troubles? You said in your witness statement that you supported the right of the Provisional IRA to act, but you did not support bombing or terrorism as a tactic. Could we look, please, at the document which is UCPI 5015994? And that's volume 3, tab 35. And could we go to page 100? This is a 1980 report on the 1982 National Delegate Conference. If we could go, please, to page 114. Now, this is a document that has been attached to an SDS report, a very large SDS report about that year's National Delegate Conference. This is one of your organisation's documents which has been taken or copied by the SDS and reported. Could you help us with what a drafting commission is as a document?
Yes, it's a group of people get together and draft it, and then it's voted on. It's like a resolution, I suppose.
Right. Well, can we look at the first two paragraphs, please? It's very difficult to read.
Yeah.
I think it says, this conference reiterates its support for the revolutionary position on terrorism. Individual terrorism, as Trotsky pointed out, is counter-revolutionary in effect, strengthening the hand of the very class enemy against whom it is directed. The actions and recent threats of the INLA and the Birmingham pub bombings are an expressive example. At the same time, revolutionaries are not against violence as such. We make, quote, a fundamental distinction between individual terrorism and the revolutionary terrorism that the oppressed masses may employ against their oppressors, as occurred, for example, in the Russian Revolution or Vietnam. Does that accurately explain why it was you were against the way that the Provisional IRA were using terrorism and the circumstances in which you as an organisation did think that the use of force would be justified?
Yes, I think it explains that individual terrorism is something which is counterproductive, and we very much stand in that tradition, that we don't think it does anything except to create more repression normally. At the same time, as I've explained already, if you look at various situations where people are facing attack, whether it's the Vietnam War or whether it's the example used here, the Russian Revolution, but I used the Portuguese Revolution as another example, I think it does express the different aspects of our position.
Thank you. And if we go to the last two paragraphs, we could move to the bottom of the page, please. I think they read, however unpalatable their politics, which are crudely nationalist, based upon class alliances, which have their own inevitable tensions, the armed Republican movement is an essential component in the struggle to get the British out of Ireland. We have to cope with that fact at the same time as we struggle to build a revolutionary fragment in the north with the help of our comrades in the south. 99% of socialists in Northern Ireland support armed struggle. We should too. The party must hammer out its attitude, if possible, towards splitting the Protestant working class from its repulsive sleeping partner, the Orange business community of the North. If it thinks that that is impossible, it should say so. Now, I'd like to dwell mainly on the first half of that second paragraph, the proposition that the Socialist Workers' Party should support the armed struggle. Was it the SWP's position that it did support the armed struggle?
Well, if you look at the what I put in the witness statement, and the whole question was that we had a position which was unconditional but not uncritical support for the Provisional IRA. What that meant was we supported their right to fight against the Northern State and against British imperialism. At the same time, we were extremely critical of their methods. And I think the wording of this actually makes that point, that we don't agree with the politics of the IRA, we don't agree with the methods that they used. At the same time, we recognise that in the north of Ireland, this was a crucial component of people fighting against British rule at the time. So those are the two aspects of it, I think, which are important to understand. And I know I think sometimes it's a difficult concept for people to understand, that you can support but also criticise. But I think in this case it was absolutely necessary to have that position.
Well, the expression of support for the armed struggle at the bottom of that document, I'd like to explore a bit further. Against what targets did the SWP support the use of violence by the Provisional IRA?
Well, it would have been against targets of the northern state. That would have been the targets. But we weren't about supporting individual actions. We didn't agree with any of those, you know, the bombings and the various things that took place. And actually it says in this document that we struggled to build a revolutionary fragment, as it's called, in the north, because it was extremely difficult for socialist ideas to get a hearing in the situation in the 70s. That obviously you had the armed struggle going on. You had, on the one hand, the Provisional IRA. You also had, on the other hand, the UDA and other loyalist paramilitaries, backed up very often by the police and the army. So those were that was the situation we found ourselves in Ireland. We wanted to build a socialist organisation like we had in Britain, but it was extremely hard to make that breakthrough. And still, I think, even today, I think it's, you know, the whole way which nationalist and unionist politics divide up, it's still difficult to do that.
Could we have a look, please, at another document? It's UCPI 5019543. It's volume 3, tab 47. Now, this is an SDS report dated the 4th of October of 1983. It appears to be about an individual, but what I'm interested in is paragraph 4, where it says, during a recent Central Committee social at the home of Chris Harman, and we've redacted for privacy, somewhat the worse for drink, spoke about the time he lived in Belfast and his companions with individual associated with Sinn Féin and the Provisional Irish Republican Army. He stated that at that time he was a member of the International Marxist Group. Without mentioning names, he said he was trusted by PIRA and remains fully sympathetic to their cause. Questions I have arising from that is, how common were such views within the SWP?
Well, I wouldn't accept that that's an accurate statement apart from anything else. I don't think it's true. The person you're referring to was involved in the campaign over the H blocks for the right of the IRA prisoners to have political status, which was a big issue. He was also involved in the campaign over the hunger strikes, which in 1981, which I can assure you was a very, very big and well-supported campaign throughout Ireland, throughout the island of Ireland. So I don't agree with this idea that he was, you know, fully sympathetic to their cause. That wasn't true. He had the same sort of criticisms that I've made of their behaviour. So I mean, I don't think you can necessarily take this as a, well, I think in this case you certainly can't take it as anything but gossip, which isn't particularly accurate. So he was involved in Irish politics, but had the same criticisms as the rest of us would have had.
And in terms of connections, direct connections and contact with the Provisional IRA, the report says it happened when the person was a member of the IMG. To what extent did the Socialist Workers' Party have direct contact with members of the Provisional IRA? I
don't think we did at all. And Sinn Féin was obviously the political wing, and as you know, Sinn Féin's now, you know, is on course to, is the major party in the north and is on course to be in the south. So things have changed very, very dramatically since the early 80s on that situation. But I think it's fair to say our people in Ireland would have known people in Sinn Féin, just as everybody who worked in politics in the north of Ireland and in the south would have known people in Sinn Féin. But Provisional IRA, we wouldn't have had. They wouldn't have wanted to have contact with us. They had a totally different aim, a military aim, which was different to what we were doing. So they wouldn't have done.
Now, you've touched upon this already in some of your answers, but I want to explore the ways in which your organisation did advance its beliefs in relation to Ireland. As I understand it, it's supporting the Troops Out movement, getting involved in campaigns such as the hunger strike and the H blocks and so forth, and protesting against the actions of the army in Northern Ireland. Have I missed anything significant?
I think by the late 70s and early 80s, that's what the main emphasis would have been. The Troops Out movement was regarded as, again, as a united front, which we were involved in and which was important to our work. I don't think it was central to our work particularly at that time. But yes, those were the sorts of things we were involved in.
And I think probably right at the start of your time in the IS, internment was a big issue, wasn't it?
Internment was a very big issue, and that obviously, by the late 70s, you're talking about the H blocks campaign and the hunger strikes. Those were and the hunger strikes were a very big political issue. So we were involved in protesting about those and about the right to get political status.
Did the SWP provide any financial assistance to any paramilitary group?
No.
Did the SWP provide any practical assistance to any paramilitary group in carrying out its operations?
No, it wouldn't have done.
Sir, is that a convenient time to take the morning break?
Yes, it would be. We will break now for a quarter of an hour and resume, therefore, if my watch is right, at a 1:45.
Thank you, sir. Ms. German, we're going to move on now to the relationship between the Socialist Workers' Party and the far right. And can we start, please, with events in Red Lion Square in 1984?
74.
Sorry, 74. Your witness statement makes clear that you thought that free speech was a concept that you didn't think should apply to fascists. And was it in line with that belief that the counter-protest was organised to shut down the ability of the fascists to organise?
Well, the protest was because the National Front had been given Conway Hall as a meeting place, and we felt this was unacceptable for the reasons that you outline, that we, unlike with everybody else where I'm in favour of free speech, I think with the fascists we make an exception because their whole aim is to destroy democratic society and to deny free speech to all sorts of people, to people on the left, to migrants and so on. So yes, there was again, it wasn't just the SWP, there was a large number of organisations and groups that organised that demonstration in Red Lion Square.
And just so we are clear, it's not just your personal opinion, this was the SWP's house line.
Yes, and I've got I wrote an article in the 80s where I explain this, which I can make available to you if that would be useful.
Thank you, it would. The build-up to the demonstration, presumably the SWP was putting out loudly and clearly the message that there was going to be a demonstration against the fascists and it would like a big turnout.
That's right, and we were at the LSE, which is just down the road, so we mobilised in the university and in other places to get people there, yeah.
And there would be no doubt in anybody's mind what the purpose of that demonstration was, namely to confront the fascists.
Well, what we wanted to do was to stop them meeting in Conway Hall, so if we'd prevented them from getting in, that would have been a main aim.
So how obvious was it that there was going to be trouble?
It was very obvious to me. I walked up, I must have gone to the LSE at the beginning, it was a Saturday obviously, but I walked up from the LSE, which is only 10-15 minutes walk up to Red Lion Square, and everywhere you could see police vans, all the side streets, Lincoln's Inn Fields, all round, everywhere. There were loads and loads of police vans, so I thought there was going to be a huge policing issue here, and we're going to be stopped from trying to demonstrate. And that was indeed what happened. There was a very, very heavy policing operation. I mean, I've never seen, before that, I'd never seen anything like it. I have since then on a few occasions, but not many. And I'm not surprised that somebody died on that day because it was very, very heavily policed and in a very violent way.
Now, you were speaking, as I understand it, about the morning of the demonstration. Could I dial you back a few days before the demonstration? How obvious was it that there was going to be trouble?
Well, I don't think we were looking for trouble. We were looking to stop the fascists from marching. The police were determined to ensure that the fascists went in, and they were prepared to have a huge policing operation in order to justify it. And I'm afraid that was the pattern we saw again and again in the 70s.
Let's imagine the police didn't turn up at all. The fascists want to organise, you want to stop them organising. Surely that was a recipe for trouble.
Well, I think it would be more like the example that I gave in my witness statement about Haggerston School, where the fascists had been allowed to meet in the school hall in Hackney. We organised a protest outside, but many of us also got into the hall and occupied the main room and stopped them from being able to have their meeting. And if the police hadn't turned up at all, I guess that's the sort of thing that would have happened. We'd have occupied the place or stopped them getting in, and they'd have gone away.
Is it your position then that prior to the day of the demonstration, it was not a foregone conclusion that there would be trouble?
I think we thought it was going to be a big issue because the fascists were meeting in a big hall. I mean, it seats 400 or so people. So we thought it would be a big issue, but we didn't go looking for trouble. We weren't the people who created the trouble.
Now, in your witness statement, and I think just now, you've essentially put the blame fairly and squarely on the police. There are others who came to a different conclusion. Lord Scarman, who inquired into events at Red Lion Square, fairly and squarely put the blame on the IMG, as I'm sure you're aware. Do you accept that the IMG, and I'm quoting now, assaulted the police in an unexpected, unprovoked and viciously violent attack?
No, I don't think that's an accurate description of what happened. And as you know, the person who was killed on the demonstration was an IMG member. And they were demonstrating perfectly acceptably. It was the police who were determined to stop people getting near the hall. That was their aim. And they continued this. When there was fighting after a while going on in the square, and when people retreated, the police pursued them and started attacking them with truncheons. They threw demonstrators over the railings. They used to have those underpasses they used to have, which were in Theobald's Road. When people were moving away and trying to get away from the police, they were pursuing them. So I don't think that's an accurate or a fair description of what happened.
Now, I want to move to a very different way in which the tension between the far left and the far right was playing out on the streets, and the victims of the racist attacks that were going on at the time. Could we have up, please, UCPI 5010659. This is not in the bundle, sir. And it's paragraph 4 that I'm interested in. This is a report by an SDS officer from 1976, from the 13th of July. And it's about a meeting which is dealing with racism in Hackney. Paragraph 4 says, several members of the audience then participated in a discussion on racialism in Hackney, but no firm conclusions were reached. However, and I'm using the words in the document, a negress in the audience stated that an organisation called the West Indian Defence Committee, based in Brixton, was presently engaged in arming with knives and koshers as many black people in Brixton as possible, and that this organisation was fully prepared to meet physical racialism in the area with physical attacks. Although no decisions were made by the Hackney branch of the International Socialists, several members expressed both their approval of such actions and their regret that anti-racialist groups were not sufficiently organised in Hackney. Was it the case that there were some in your organisation who did approve of arming with knives and koshers and so forth?
I must say, I think this is a very bizarre report. I mean, it comes to the conclusion that nothing was decided. It says that several members expressed their approval of such actions. Well, maybe, but that clearly wasn't the dominant view. I'd be very surprised if people expressed their approval for those actions, because we always try to look at the fight against racism as a collective issue and not just simply whether people could physically defend themselves. There's many people in the black and Asian communities who have repeatedly defended themselves against individual attack, and I would absolutely support their right to do it in these circumstances. But it wasn't something that we ever saw as an effective way of building an anti-racist campaign. So I must say, I regard the accuracy of this statement as not particularly high from my experience of knowing people in Hackney and of the time.
Well, perhaps I can put it this way. I'm not suggesting this was a party line or anything like that, but what I want to explore with you is Were there hotheads within your ranks?
I think this kind of line of questioning, I mean, you know, you look at these documents which were written a long, long time ago. Were the hotheads in the ranks? They don't really have any, you know, time and again when I've looked at all these things, there's no real evidence of this coming from these statements, and therefore I take them with this type of statement with a very big pinch of salt. And of course people react differently. Of course somebody might say, well, good for them, but that doesn't mean they would do it themselves, and it doesn't mean that they saw it in that way. And I think it's important to understand that when we talk about fighting against the racists, we always try to stress that it should be a collective thing, that it should be done through the unions, through mass campaigns, rather than this kind of individual action.
Yeah, we can take that document down now, thank you.
Could I just comment as well about the negress?
Yeah, I mean, the use of language is terrible, isn't it?
Well, and even in the 1970s, people didn't talk like that for the most part. You know, I just think it's worth saying.
I want to zoom out a bit, but staying on the question of hotheads. Were you conscious in the way that you acted within the Central Committee that what you said might influence the more volatile of your members?
What we tried to do as a Central Committee was to give a line to the organisation, which the organisation followed or didn't. I mean, people didn't always do exactly what we said in the positive sense. So in other words, if you said, we want you to go to a picket line at 6 in the morning, maybe half the people you asked would go and the other half won't. But generally, we accepted that was, people would accept the kind of position we put forward. And we very much stressed particularly over this because we knew the nature of the society at the time. We knew there were a lot of individual attacks. I mean, this is a dangerous time. It's a dangerous time for socialists as well as for black and Asian people, because if you had your badge on, if you were getting on the tube to Stratford, you were very likely to get attacked physically by a fascist on the tube. That was the situation we were in. So we were very careful that we didn't want this to become a kind of individual gang fight between left and right. That would have been a step backwards in my view.
Can we move now to 1977 and Lewisham? In the run-up to the demonstration and counter-demonstration at Lewisham, what was the line that the Central Committee was putting out?
Well, I wasn't on the Central Committee at the time, but the line that we were putting out was that it was going to be a very, very important demonstration. It was clear, this was clear to the people of Lewisham, it was clear to the left in general, and it was clear to the fascists. They saw this as, and they termed it very much as about mugging and about violence of black people in Lewisham. And we knew this was going to be a very important demonstration, so we did encourage people to come. As I've said, at the time, there was a by-election which we were standing in Ladywood in Birmingham, and I was up there for 3 weeks working on that by-election. I would have gone to it if I'd been in London, but as we decided that there was going to be a fascist march in Birmingham because they were standing in the election as well. So we stayed in Birmingham and had a counter protest to that. But I think otherwise I would have been on it, and so would a great many other people. Thousands of people came on it. And, you know, so I think we saw it as an important, in a way, we saw it as important in terms of making it clear that the fascists weren't going to be able to march through those kind of areas and to use particular issues in order to strengthen their position.
Can you recall whether the party line was to encourage people to attend the Alcaraf demonstration in the morning or the gathering at Lewisham, at the bottom of Lewisham Way, or both?
People went to both, or some people went to both, but we said, for people who aren't aware, this was a demonstration that was held away from where the fascists were going to march. So we said, fine, but we think it's important that we actually do go to where they are demonstrating and we attempt to block their march. And that was what we wanted to do. We were quite open about this and that we could see the value of the Alcaraf demonstration, but we also thought just doing that and not trying to prevent them from marching would be a mistake.
And so this is it another expression of the SWP's policy of closing down the far right's right to freedom of expression?
We regarded it as important, particularly that they weren't allowed to march through these areas. And they didn't march around areas like this, right? They didn't march in the well-to-do areas. They went to the poorest areas with large migrant populations, and they deliberately chose these areas, and they did so for a specific reason. They did so because they wanted to intimidate the local population. And it was remarkable that after most of these demonstrations, you would have an increase in attacks on black and ethnic minorities. So we felt that was a very important thing to do, yes.
Now, the inquiry's had some evidence of some film of what happened, and the main trouble seems to have started as the National Front demonstration moved into the main road, onto the A2, and bricks were thrown at them and the police. Is that your understanding of what happened?
I think that's definitely the case, that nobody is saying that at Lewisham there wasn't fighting. There was fighting. But the question is, why was there the fighting? The local community, the local young people particularly, but backed up by nearly everybody in their community, saw it as important that these people weren't allowed to march. So, yes.
I mean, what I want to give you the opportunity to comment on in particular was this seems to have been an instance where the violence was initiated from the left wing.
I don't think so. I think you have to see it as the violence is initiated by the people who decide they're going to have a hostile march through this area, and it's allowed to happen by the police. And those two things, I think, are important. And what the demonstration, as I say, I wasn't there, but the demonstration, as I understand it, tried to block the road and tried to stop them getting through. And I think that was an absolutely justified thing to do.
And would you condone the throwing of bricks at people?
Not particularly, no, but I do understand why people get into the state that they get in over these things. I think lots of young people at the time were very, very angry about this, particularly in those areas. And the truth is that they felt that this was the only way they could express themselves. I think it would have been much better if the police hadn't protected this march, and then we wouldn't have had these kind of problems.
Was one of the consequences of confronting the fascists on the streets that violence and trouble was inevitable?
Well, again, I mean, I think this kind of way of approaching it is, it seems to me that a lot of the questioning this morning has been about my politics rather than about what might be wrong with other people's politics, or indeed the role of the undercover police, which is the aim of the inquiry. And I think that that's slightly regrettable, really, that it's going like this. The idea we're responsible for the problem because we identify a real problem of the fascist marching, and what was clearly policy that whoever decided it, that the Metropolitan Police would defend. And as I've said to you earlier, you only have to look at the pictures to see to what extent the policing was involved. The number of police in Red Lion Square, the number of police at Lewisham, the number of police at Southall, which still, when I look at the pictures even now, takes my breath away. When you look at all of those, then to say it's our fault that there was violence just seems to me is completely wrong.
I'm not suggesting, this question isn't about fault. It was literally what it said. The consequence of coming out to confront the fascists on the streets was that violence was inevitable.
Yes, and the consequence of not coming out on the streets would be that there'll be more attacks on black people. I mean, this is a time where black people were being killed, where people were being seriously attacked all the time. This was the whole atmosphere in these areas. It was the atmosphere in East London. It was the atmosphere where I lived. All of those things, the consequence if we hadn't done it would have been much, much worse for people.
Can I remind you of a passage from a book you wrote, People's History of London, for your account of this event. It's Doc 083. The relevant passage reads, "An important turning point came in Lewisham, South London, in the summer of 1977. Most of the left, local trade union organisations and the Communist Party held a rally in opposition to a National Front march. The majority planned to march at some distance from the National Front's proposed route. But those who thought the National Front should be physically confronted, mainly the Socialist Workers' Party and black youth from the local community, went on to gather at a point on the National Front's route where they thought the march could be blocked. Despite a heavy police presence, the anti-fascists did indeed break through the police cordon and disrupt the National Front march. Mounted police charged the protesters and riot shields were used for the first time in mainland Britain. Fighting with the police lasted long after the National Front had gone home. The establishment's disapproval was shrill, and even the left-wing Labour leader, Michael Foot, described those who had broken up the National Front march as red fascists. It was a watershed which led to the formation of the Anti-Nazi League." Do you stand by that passage?
Yes, I do.
Coming back to the question I asked you earlier, if trouble was inevitable, it was the police's duty, wasn't it, to police public disorder?
But that isn't what happened at Lewisham. And I think two things. I think, firstly, when I say that they wanted to block the march, that's exactly what I've been trying to explain to you. I also think you have to put this in the context, and perhaps if people are interested, to read the rest of the chapter, which talks about the situation that developed, particularly after Enoch Powell's speech, Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, the growth of the fascists in the early 1970s, and the way in which the fascists needed to be confronted. So I think this is the context that you have to look at it in. And the idea that this is about simply that the police were impartially trying to keep order just isn't true. It just simply is not the case. If you look at it, their role was very, very much to protect the fascist march, and this was something that I think was helped to lead to any disorder.
Can I now put a specific report to you, please? It's MPS-0732-886. Not in the bundle, sir.
So that I can identify it later, can you give me its date, please?
It's 1st of September 1977. It's page 4 that I'd like, please. This is a police report compiled after the event. It's the very bottom paragraph that I'm interested in. Finally, it is known that one member of the SWP was armed with an air pistol at Lewisham, which, given the opportunity, he would have used to shoot at the police and members of the National Front. An Asian man, thought to be an SWP supporter, had in his possession a book which had the centre cut out to conceal a knife. Do you have any knowledge of either the air pistol or the knife?
No, I don't, and I'm not at all sure that these are accurate reports either. I mean, this is something we've been told is the case. There's absolutely no evidence for it, and I think when we look at some of the reports, it's like some of the ones we've talked about previously. This is things which are hearsay or just they talk about, but there's absolutely no evidence of this at all, or indeed that anything happened with these weapons if they did indeed exist.
The answer to this question may be obvious, but it's important that you answer it in your own words. Assuming, for the purposes of this question, that this is true, can I take it that this wouldn't have been condoned by the Central Committee?
I don't assume that it's true, but if it were the case, it wouldn't have been condoned.
Can we move now, that can be taken down, can we move now to an event at which you were present on many days, the dispute at Grunwick's? Can we start with the aim of the SWP? Was it to assist those striking to prevent the picket line being crossed by people who were going into work?
The strike at Grunwick's was a very long strike. It was involving mainly Asian women. They faced an incredible attack from their employer, who was really, really strongly anti-union. He also was involved with the National Association for Freedom, so it was about trying to break the whole union and the union movement. So it was regarded as a very important strike. So yes, it was there to assist them in winning and to help them to have a picket which was going to be effective and which would stop the workers who've been replacing them from coming in.
And the police were trying to prevent that from happening and to facilitate workers going into the factory.
They came in on a bus, and the police's aim was to try to let that bus through. And this was a picket line which at various points was supported by Labour cabinet ministers. Shirley Williams was down there, people like that. It was a very, very widely supported strike, and it was felt that it was unjustified to allow this to become became a kind of cause célèbre, with this right-wing organisation using it as a means of trying to attack the unions on a wider scale.
You described the strike breakers in your witness statement as scabs. That was
That's a common
commonly
expression.
Used expression.
I think it still is, yeah.
I mean, highly pejorative, isn't it?
Well, it's a bit like talking about hotheads or things like that, isn't it? I mean, it's...
And would it be fair to say feelings ran very high against the scabs?
Well, you weren't directly confronting them because they were in the bus. So, but yes, people were very much opposed to them.
But however strongly the strikers and members of your organisation felt about their actions, strike breaking was not unlawful, was it?
I don't know whether it was unlawful to do what they did. I don't know.
And was the object of...
Give me a moment. On what basis can it be said that they were doing anything unlawful?
I don't know. I just said I don't know the answer to that.
Forgive me.
And was the object, as you saw it, to try to overwhelm the police and break through and prevent the coaches getting in?
We wanted to stop the coaches getting in. That was the main aim of the operation, and we wanted to give support to Mrs. Desai and the other people on the picket line.
And that overwhelming the picket line at one point was exactly what did happen, as you explain in your statement.
On the day of the mass picket, yeah. I mean, most days there were less people than that, obviously.
Was it essentially when the miners turned up?
The miners turned up, all sorts of other people turned up. So that was probably thousands of people, and it was in a very small road.
Would it be fair to say it was the deliberate aim to push through those police lines?
Well, the deliberate aim was to stop the bus going through, and I think it achieved it on that day.
Now, once again, you find yourself differing with Lord Scarman. Lord Scarman conducted a statutory investigation and concluded, and I'll read it, the union Apex, we are satisfied, had no intention of provoking violence and civil disorder by calling for the mass picket. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that the risk of a mass picket getting out of control was known. A mass picket allows violent extremists to participate. Such people cannot be prevented from joining it and will use the opportunity it presents to provoke civil disorder, which in itself is sure to prejudice the very cause which the picket was called to promote. Is that in fact what happened?
Well, I don't agree with this idea about violent extremists. There were thousands and thousands of people who came on that picket and many others who turned up on other days. And I think if we're going to talk about pejorative terms, that is one that I think should be avoided. I know it's frequently put by the undercover policing people, but it doesn't strike me as it's an accurate way of looking at it. So, unfortunately, I would have to disagree with Lord Scarman over that as well.
Moving away from the dispute at Grunwicks to a general statement, a statement you made about the ANL in your witness statement. And you say that the ANL insisted that the fascists and the National Front had to be confronted physically on the streets in order to prevent them gaining support from the very beginning. What did you mean by confront physically?
I think I've explained that really, that they should be, if we can in any way stop them from marching, then that should be the aim of what we're doing. And that was central to the whole idea. There was if you look in the 1970s, there was a whole argument about should we directly confront them or should we just talk about, other ways of, maybe changing the law and so on. And I think for many of us in the Anti-Nazi League, not everybody, but many of us felt you had to stop them from marching. And this has become now a very, very normal thing that happens. Luckily, the threat of fascism isn't anywhere near as great now as it was then, but it's become much more accepted that people don't want them to march through areas of high ethnic minorities, for example. So I don't think there's anything particularly remarkable about that.
But by using the phrase physically confront them, that's what you had in mind might be necessary.
Well, as I say, if you're saying you don't want them to march and you want to stop them marching, you may have to physically confront them.
Can we move now to children? We touched on SCAN earlier. I'd like to take you to a document that comes from the SDS reporting on the 1980 SWP National Delegate Conference. It's UCPI 5016148. That's volume 2, tab 16. And if we could go to page 55, please. Now, this again is a drafting commission paper that's been obtained and attached to the officer's report. I'd like to direct your attention to first of all, to the preamble. The gist of the preamble is it expresses the very grave concerns about fascist activity that were felt at that time. I'll give you an opportunity to read that. And in that context, it then goes on at paragraph 1 to say it should be a top priority to organise against the Nazis in schools and on the football terraces, which they are making their recruiting grounds. The ANL has produced a school students' NUSS leaflet, and this should be distributed as widely as possible. Does that fairly describe what the SWP was doing in schools at the time and why?
I think that when you look at the preamble and that point that you've just made, I think that when you look at this whole question of the Anti-Nazi League, and they say we were successful quite early on in beginning to identify them as Nazis, which was very, very important to do because, as I said, the whole memory of the Second World War was still fairly recent, and people didn't like Nazis, quite rightly, and could see that there was an issue there. So I think you have to put it in the context that we were trying to get across that the people around the NF weren't acting in the interests of ordinary people, but were actually fascists who were going to destroy society, and particularly were going to scapegoat ethnic minorities. Now, when it comes to a top priority to organise against the Nazis in schools, on the football terraces, this is because they were aiming at young people, and we wanted to counter that. Now, that was mainly done through leafleting and other activities of that sort.
I'll take that as a yes. Is that fair?
Sorry, yes, that's the answer.
Would you accept that schools becoming a political battleground between groups on opposing ends of the political spectrum would be a concern both for the authorities and many parents?
I think the problem we have, and the problem we had then, but it occurs with other issues now, is that you can't keep politics out of schools, and particularly teenage children, are aware of a whole number of issues that go on and that they do have comments on. So yes, you don't want it to turn into a battle between two groups of school students. At the same time, we felt it was very important. We worked with teachers over this. We worked with all sorts of people to try to get across what we thought the danger of the National Front was.
Thank you. Could we take that down, please? And I'm going to move now to the Right to Work campaigns and the Right to Work marches. You've explained it in your witness statement, but if you could explain it just succinctly now, what were the Right to Work marches?
They came out of, obviously, a period of high unemployment in the mid-1970s. The first one was in 1976. Unemployment was something that hadn't been seen in Britain since the 1930s. I mean, since the Second World War, essentially, there was full employment. So this was a big shock at all sorts of levels for people. And we felt that we had to be part of organising campaigning against unemployment, and particularly against youth unemployment, which was a big issue. And we felt it also connected in some ways with some of the previous discussion we've had about the dangers of the far right, and unemployment has been a sort of recruiting ground for the far right at different times. So we wanted to channel this into a very different direction against the government, and we did it, as I say, firstly against what was then the Labour government. Then, of course, it became much bigger when unemployment grew still further again under Margaret Thatcher.
What was the role of the SWP in the Right to Work marches?
Well, we helped to set it up. We worked with all sorts of people from the Labour left, other people in the trade unions. So we were involved in it, but it was something that other people were involved in. It's an example, again, of the United Front.
Can I ask you, first of all, now about the 1976 march? I'm reading from the Special Branch annual report about that year. It said their progress attracted little publicity, and on arrival, and it's talking about arrival in London, about 80 strong on the outskirts of London, they took the opportunity of attacking their police escort. In what amounted to a running battle, 44 officers were injured and 43 members arrested. Were you a witness to any of these events?
No, I wasn't on the... but I have to say that was they disputed that account, and I think a Trades Council inquiry actually disputed that account as well.
What, that there were 44 injuries and 43 arrests?
That we took the opportunity to attack the police. That wasn't as we recalled it or as we argued it. But I wasn't at the event.
Would it be fair to say that there was certainly trouble?
Yes, that's a matter of record that there was trouble. But it depends where you think that originated. It's worth saying in that as well that this was the day before we had a rally in the Albert Hall in support of the marchers, where we got 5,000 people came to the event. So it had very wide support from trade unionists and others.
I'm going to move now to an area that we're particularly interested in because you can give us some eyewitness evidence about undercover police officers. I'm going to start with the 1980 Right to Work March. An officer who used the cover name Colin Clark was the treasurer, national treasurer for the Right to Work March 1980, wasn't he? I would like you please to assist us by telling us what you can recall of Colin Clark, how he behaved and what he did.
Well, Colin Clark was, as you say, the treasurer of the Right to Work campaign, and obviously this was a deliberate decision to get into positions where he worked for the SWP at different times to do with finance and to do with getting names of people, and he did so with the treasurer of the Right to Work. Now, the march I was on was in 1981, which Colin Clark, I think in his statement, says he wasn't on, but that isn't true because he definitely was on it, and I remember him very, very well on it. Because he was the treasurer, he was responsible for making sure we had enough money to pay for things as we went on, which they're very costly because you have to obviously feed everybody and do all those kind of things, transport people. And he was very central to it all. I always found him quite helpful to work with. He was, and maybe this was the intention, that he was always quite helpful with money and everything else. And it was only later that I began to think that maybe he was a police spy because he disappeared, said he was going abroad, and nobody ever heard from him again, which as we now know is a pattern. And I think it makes me very uncomfortable, the whole idea that I worked with him closely for 3 weeks and I knew him at other times and worked with him over certain things. I think it's very disturbing that he was in this position. I don't see any justification for it at all.
Just to be clear, were you on the 1980 march as well?
No, the one I organised, or I was central to organising, was the 1981 one. It was September 1981. It went from Liverpool to Manchester and then up through the all the Lancashire towns to Blackpool. So that's why it took 3 weeks.
Can you help us with whether Colin Clark, as he was styling himself, participated in any decisions?
Oh yes, he did. Yes, he would have been. We discussed most days. I mean, not most of it was at the level of should we go and visit such and such a factory, or where are we going to get the money from because we've got problems with getting enough food for tomorrow, or whatever it was. I mean, they were mostly those kind of decisions. But definitely, I discussed with him, particularly when we were close to Blackpool, because we were aware that we didn't want lots of these were very young people. They came from kind of council estates in Cumbernauld in Scotland and Liverpool and various other places. We didn't want them to do anything which might lead to them getting arrested. And I remember having discussions with him about that, which I now regard as, a complete breach of trust, really.
And what was his line on that?
Well, his line was to, we would have discussions about this, and he agreed that, he's not going to say, is he, to me, we should get them arrested. That might be what he wanted to do, but he's not going to say that when we're sitting there discussing how we can avoid a dangerous situation.
Putting to one side what one might describe as mundane decisions, did he participate in any decisions that you would describe as significant?
Well, I think that was a significant discussion and a significant decision, and he will have participated in a whole range of things because he was in discussion with the various people who were leading the march, and therefore, whether it was a smaller issue or whether it was a larger issue, Colin Clark will have been involved in it. So he put himself very much at the centre of the operation, in a role that obviously was important for us, and he did so quite deliberately, presumably to find out as much information as he could.
Are there any specific decisions that he took or influenced that caused you particular concern?
No, my concern about him was more general. I mean, I just find that when I think about this now, and I've thought about it a lot, obviously, recently, but I've also, as I said to you, thought about it in earlier times, I think it's extremely disquieting, the level at which these people made themselves so central to things. And as I said in my witness statement, I was a young woman then, I was between relationships. I'm not suggesting that there was any likelihood that he or I would have had a relationship, but that was obviously, we socialised and we did all those things, and it makes... I'm not trying to suggest it's at all like the women who've suffered in the way that they have with these sexual relationships that people have had, but I feel it's a very uncomfortable thing to think back on and to look back on, and as I say, I find no justification for it whatever.
Can you help us with the officer who used the cover name Phil Cooper at this stage, just in relation to right to work marchers?
Phil Cooper wasn't on that march, to the best of my recollection. He was on later marches, to the best of my recollection, so which I wasn't on. I mean, I may have gone to protests at the conferences when they got there, gone for the day, but I wasn't part of organising those marches.
And we'll come back to his role in the headquarters later on. On the 1981 march, was there trouble?
No. It was a big march. We had several hundred people on it, and that's a lot of political and logistical organisation to do this for 3 weeks. It's a big job. As I've said, they were young people for the most part, so quite inexperienced politically, whatever you'd want to call it. And it was a remarkable, successful thing. We went to towns every night. We were put up by local trade unions. We were put up in community halls. We visited workplaces. People would speak. We'd have maybe a little rally in a public place every night, and some of these marchers would speak. It was an extremely well-organised operation, which had a political aim rather than any kind of physical confrontation, and there wasn't one.
I'm going to ask you a little bit about the 1980 march. I appreciate you weren't there, and if you're not in a position to answer, please just say so. But we've seen the reports of the 1980 march, which indicate that there was some trouble when the march reached Southall, and that 7 people were arrested, and then there was more trouble in Brighton when the marchers joined a total of, it is recorded, about 8,000 people who were shouting abuse at members of the Conservative Party, and there were some arrests there. The police assert that only the presence of a large number of police officers prevented more serious violence at Brighton. Does that picture accord with your understanding of what happened from your conversations with members of your party?
Well, I do recall that the march was perfectly... There were no problems at all with the march until it got to Southall. In other words, until it got into the Metropolitan Police area. Brighton, it strikes me as a rather odd thing for the police to say that it was only because there was a big police presence. There's always a huge presence at any party conference, and particularly at the Conservative Party conference. So that would have happened anyway. So I'm not quite clear what is being suggested.
I'm just...
You're only asking the question.
Yes, just trying to establish the
Okay.
facts. I see. Okay, well, I think in that case we can move to 1982. And again, I appreciate you weren't on the march, but I don't think you will need to have been for this next question. Could we have up UCPI 5015888? Volume 3, sir, tab 34. Now, this is a report with some attachments about the culmination of the 1982 march. What I'd like to show you first of all is page 11. Now, I think you've had a chance to look at this document. This is the one which attaches lots and lots of checks, copies of checks. There's lots of information about who was supporting and funding the 1982 Right to Work campaign. Now, this document is part of those enclosures and appears to be a piece of paper recording the scale of donations. Most of the donations are made by organisations, and we have been able to publish them. But in a couple of places, we've had to make redactions for privacy in relation to, as you will see, some pretty small donations, one at item 16, £2. I'd just like, first of all, can you confirm that this type of information held by the Socialist Workers' Party was confidential?
Well, it was confidential, except obviously it was leaked by the undercover people working there. But it was meant to be confidential, yes.
That takes me to my next question. I'd like your reaction, please, to the fact the police obtained copies of and have stored, and either they or the security service have stored since then, a record of a private donation of £2 to the 1982 Right to Work March.
Well, I think the whole thing's astonishing, really, that they've got this list of union branches, of, as you say, a couple of private individuals. This just seems to me, why on earth is this acceptable? Why on earth did they need to have this information? I don't understand. It's a perfectly above-board operation. It was perfectly legal. These donations will have been agreed by union branches, and therefore they're completely acceptable. It's not like any individual is just giving these donations with the exception of the individual people, but the vast majority will have been agreed by a branch committee or several people in a branch. The only reason they can do this, it seems to me, is tied in with the wider questions of blacklisting and particularly looking at particular union branches in ways which I think in a democracy we should be able to, as union members, donate money to who we want without it being the subject of surveillance.
Can I ask you now, for the benefit of your wide experience...
Forgive me, Mr. Barr. It is, I'm afraid, distracting if people talk in a way that can be heard as it can be. Could I ask you to keep what you want to say to each other until after the morning session is over? Or if you really need to say it urgently, go outside and do it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like the benefit of your long experience of the workings of the Socialist Workers' Party to help us with some of the positions of authority that were assumed by SDS undercover officers. First of all, the roles of branch and district treasurer. It must be self-evident that they have access to financial information at respectively branch and district level, and who was making donations and so forth. And we've seen reporting enclosing financial details. But can you help us as to, on the ground, what sort of level of meetings they're attending, what sort of participation you would expect a district or branch treasurer to be making to their branch or district?
Well, I think the main role, obviously they had to pay out for, if you're hiring a hall or things like that, but the main role of the branch and district treasurers was actually to get people to pay subs and to make sure they're paying their subscriptions every month or every week. And in that situation, of course, it's a very central role because it gives you access to the names and very often the bank accounts of the individuals concerned in the particular branch. And obviously, this can be passed on to people who are engaged in blacklisting and everything else. And that's obviously what happened. District treasurers in particular would be very likely to be delegates to bigger meetings like conferences and other national meetings that went on. So they would also have access to the whole national organisation.
An obvious question, but I have to ask it. And all of this financial information confidential?
Yes, it is. It's meant to be confidential.
Contact secretary. Are you able to help us with that, what that would involve?
Well, again, this will be somebody who will know the names of people around the organisation, people who may have come to meetings or we may regularly get the paper to them or any of those sorts of things, and will be privy to, again, their names, their addresses, possibly their bank account, where they work, which is a central question when we know what's happened to a lot of people in this situation. So it strikes me that this is one of the main reasons that these roles have been so eagerly taken up by undercover police.
Again, all confidential information?
It should be, yeah, it should be.
Do they get access to any decision-making meetings with this sort of post?
Definitely at a district level, they almost certainly will be likely to be delegates. It's not necessarily the case, but many of them will be delegates to conferences and to other national meetings. So then they have the access to hundreds of people. They will all go to events like Skegness, where loads of the names obviously have been passed on.
The officer who was a contact secretary was actually at branch level in the Twickenham branch. So is there anything you can help us with about what a contact secretary at branch level is likely to be getting involved in?
They may or may not be going as delegates. I mean, that's impossible to know at this stage. It's worth saying the Twickenham branch was, of course, a branch where there was a big argument in, I can't remember, 1974 or 75, which led to a split in the organisation. So I think it's interesting that they had somebody in there, and I'm sure that they will have played a role, presumably, in not in calming down any argument, but in exacerbating it.
Socialist worker organiser. Could you help us with what that is and what access that gives someone who holds that position or influence?
Again, this is something where you'll be responsible for distributing the paper to people, collecting the paper from, if you're in London, collecting it from what was then the print shop. You will be responsible for organising sales. And it was a very central role in a branch and in a district, the person who did that role. It was a very, very central role. Nearly always you would be, again, at the national conferences and things like that. You'd be, you might well be introducing meetings and all those kind of things.
District Social Committee.
Social Committee.
Yeah, this is...
I don't quite understand that.
We know...
I don't think they had a whole committee for organising social events, but maybe.
Well, this is Vince Harvey, 1976 to 1979 deployment in Walthamstow, and one of the positions we understand he assumed, as well as being a branch and then a district treasurer, was a district social committee. Do I take it you probably not the best placed person to help us with that?
I guess that means that he organised some social events, but I don't know. And obviously that was part of his whole operation.
Headquarters. We know that the officer who used the name Phil Cooper infiltrated your headquarters. Can you help us really to set the scene? What is a headquarters like? Is it small? Is it large? How many people are there?
When these people were involved, we had a considerable operation, in the sense that we had offices which dealt with the political jobs, you know, the socialist worker and all those sorts of things. We also had journalists who worked on the paper, but we also had a print shop which was considerable, which had lots of people working there. And so you would be working among 40, 50 people probably at one time. Maybe not quite that many, but not far off, 35 or...
Now, the term headquarters conjures up an image of the people at the very top of the organisation being present. Was that true for
At
the
one
SWP?
point we had an office which was about half a mile down the road, and not everybody worked from the office. Some people did, some didn't. Some just worked from home and only came in for meetings. But by and large, the leadership, or a reasonable section of the leadership, would be in the headquarters, yes.
Does it follow that Phil Cooper would have been rubbing shoulders frequently with people at the very top of the organisation?
Yes.
Can you recall doing so?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Can you help us with how he behaved and what he did?
He behaved as with Colin Clark. These are people who quite deliberately didn't particularly get involved in arguments, didn't particularly do any of those things. They did a routine, important job in the office. They would have gone to the meetings. They would have gone to meetings in their own district or branch, and we did have print shop meetings as well for the whole staff about a range of things. Sometimes more generally political, sometimes about more practical things. They would have gone to all of those, and they would have been at social events. If we went to the pub on a Friday night, or if it was somebody's birthday or any of those, they would have been at all of those. And of course that's important for them in picking up all sorts of things about individuals that no doubt they wanted to do.
Did he keep a high or a low profile?
Fairly low profile, I would say.
Can you recall whether or not he influenced any decisions?
Well, he didn't influence decisions in the sense that he was a member of the Central Committee or anything else, but he will have had a lot of influence over the kind of things, access to loads of information about finance, about names of people, and that to me is the most damaging thing.
We'll come back to the documents that he obtained in a moment, but is there anything else you'd like to tell us about what Phil Cooper said or did, or how he behaved?
No, I think as I say, I don't think he was particularly high profile in the job, but of course he didn't need to be so high profile in order to obtain a great deal of information, which obviously wouldn't have been given to him if people had had any idea about his role.
I'm now going to embark upon what's the final stage of what are my questions today. You'll be delighted to learn. But I'm going to put various documents to you, and the theme is I'm going to put the documents, we'll look at the documents, then I want to have your reaction to them. I'd like to start with some documents. The general theme is they're about you. Can we start, please, in Volume 1, Tab 1. This is UCPI 5011563. This is an SDS report about a meeting at Holborn Library of the London district of the SWP, which occurred on the 15th of October 1977. If we could go to page 2, please, and then down to the bottom of that page to look at paragraphs 8 and 9. 8 and 9, it reads, after a brief discussion period, the conference moved swiftly into the third session of the day, which featured Lindsey German, the new Central London organiser, who spoke on recruitment and cadre and branch building. And then paragraph 9 summarises what the officer says it was that you were talking about, very much on those lines. It appears, therefore, that the SDS are reporting on you pretty much from the moment that you are promoted in 1977. Can we move now to UCPI 50-13669, please? This is volume 1, tab 9. This is a report, an SDS report dated the 14th of December 1979. At paragraph 2, it reads, at the first meeting of the Central Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party, which was elected at the 1979 National Delegate Conference, the following areas of responsibility were allocated. And then there's a list of names and responsibilities. You are listed as a woman's organiser. Am I right in understanding that this is the first time that a Central Committee met and had been created?
Sorry, this particular Central Committee? I guess so, yeah.
So they seem to have followed your appointment in 1979 onto the Central Committee. Can we take that down, please, and go to Volume 1, Tab 12, UCPI 50-13961. This is a report dated the 12th of May 1980. It reads, the undermentioned persons were identified as being present at the Blair Peach demonstration held in central London on Sunday the 27th of April 1980. If we move to page 3, there's a very, very long list of names, most of which we've redacted on grounds of privacy, but at the bottom of page 3, your name appears. You knew Blair Peach, didn't you?
Yeah.
And this was a demonstration to mark the anniversary of his death, wasn't it? There's a report that perhaps we don't need to turn up. If you can't remember it, I'm happy to turn it up, though, from 1982, which shows that you'd been reported on for so long that they were asking for an updated photograph of you. Do you recall that?
I don't recall it, no.
Well, let's have a look. It's UCPI 50-15986, Volume 3, Tab 36. And that's dated the 7th of December 1982. Paragraph 2, this report brings up to date what is on record concerning the Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, under the headings as shown. And if we go to page 2, and look at paragraph 3, it reads, the photographs on file of the undermentioned persons are no longer a good likeness and require updating. And then your name is one of 2 that appears there. Staying with volume 3, so if we can go to tab 45, and on the display we can take down the current document and replace it with UCPI 50-19408. This is a report dated the 24th of August 1983, it's a report about you. It says that paragraph 2, Lindsey German, Central Committee member of the Socialist Workers' Party, has moved to, then we've redacted the details, provides a telephone number. It says who you are sharing your address with and provides some details about that person, including membership of the SWP and the role within the party. Paragraph 3 reads, German first met privacy on the 1981 Right to Work march from Liverpool to Blackpool. Privacy became an SWP member whilst on this march and has since experienced a meteoric rise within the party. Having shown you those documents...
Sorry, you carry on. I just wanted to query this, but anyway, yeah.
Well, we were just getting to the point
Yeah.
where, having shown you that barrage of documents about you, I want to give you the opportunity to react, whether on points of factual accuracy, but just as importantly, what your reaction is to all of this reporting about you.
Well, can I first say on this last one, so the point 3 is completely inaccurate. I didn't first meet the person on the Right to Work march. He didn't become an SWP member while on the march. He was already a member, and he was an organiser in Scotland and then became an organiser in London. So he had no meteoric rise within the party. So it's tripe, really, that whole bit. You know, I feel with this particular thing about my address and who I live with, I feel it's a completely unjustified intrusion. I've always been on the electoral register. I had a mortgage at the time. It's hardly, you know, that I'm moving from house to house and that you can't find me. All of this was completely in the public record. I don't see the point of these kind of reports, which basically are both inaccurate and quite pointless. And I felt this about a lot of the various things that I've seen, which have been things, many of which were in the public record. You know, the annual event at Skegness was advertised in Socialist Worker. Marxism was advertised in Socialist Worker. There's no secrecy about it. So what on earth they think is the value of this is beyond me. But I wanted to particularly pick up actually on the Blair Peach demonstration, because I feel, just to give people the background, I knew Blair. He was a neighbour of mine at the time, and I would see him. I wasn't a close friend of his, but I would see him in the pub. I would see him at meetings and things like that. I didn't go on the Southall demonstration because I was ill, but my partner at the time did, and said it was one of the most violent demonstrations he's ever been on. I know you have a witness statement from somebody who was on the march, where she had her head cracked open with a police truncheon. We know that Blair was murdered by police, and that's not disputed now. That's the truth. We know they went tooled up. Again, if you look at the report from the that was given by the Amnesty report, we also know from some of the statements in these reports how contemptuous they were of the people who were demonstrating, and particularly there's a reference to just after Blair died, when his funeral took place. Now, that was a funeral of thousands and thousands of people who marched through East London, where he lived and where he taught in the school there. And he was buried in a cemetery just in Bow. It's described, in the report, it's described as mourners in inverted commas, which I regard as a tremendous affront, particularly since the police were responsible for his death. It said we used the demonstration for our own ends, our own political ends, which is the whole kind of basis of these kind of arguments. And I think for the following year, when we had a commemoration march, to have so many people listed as subversive as any of these things, I think is a complete disgrace, really. And I think it tells you something about the mindset of the people who were doing this undercover policing, and just the way in which they regarded demonstrators. And just the final point on that, I noticed that one of the undercover police was warned off going on the Southall demonstration because the uniformed police were going to crack down on it. And that's something that I think tells us a great deal. So I feel with these really that they're symptomatic of a much, much bigger problem, which I think needs to be addressed by the inquiry, which is the way in which the police treated people who were going about perfectly legitimate political activity in an absolutely appalling way.
Thank you. Sir, would this be a convenient moment to break for lunch?
Certainly it would. We'll break until, by my watch, 2:05 to give us a full hour. Are you content with that?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good. You're not finding, you appear to me to be giving your best without undue difficulty, but if that's wrong, all you ever have to do is to say, and I can break to allow
Thanks
you to
very
recuperate.
much, but I'm fine, thank you.
Good. Then we'll resume at 5:05.